why are we here this evening? We're here this evening to hear from the author of the new award-winning, the American Educational Research Association's Book of the Year winner. The author is Professor David Kirp, who's the James D. Marver Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. And he has written this incredible book, which I first came to discover last summer when I used it in one of my classes, and my students were quite responsive to it. And I was reading this book as I opened it, and it was just a page turner, and I said, oh, this writing is so crisp, and it's so good, and I'm really liking this. And then I realized he's a former newspaper editor, so that explains some of this quality writing that he's done. So Professor Kirp has, from the beginning of his career as a professor at Harvard and the founding director of the Harvard Center for Law and Education, he has focused on children's policy and education issues, and that's been the main focus of his work, starting from the cradle to college to career. He has worked in government, with government agencies and foundations, as well as teaching and doing quite a bit of community activism, addressing all of these issues at the ground level. But between 2008, the 2008 election and the inauguration, he served on the transition team for President Obama. He has written a number of other books, and the one pattern I seem to notice is that they all win awards. He has so many awards for just about for every book, and there is quite a lengthy list of these books. I'll just note a few of them. Kids First, 5 Big Ideas for Transforming the Lives of Children, which won the Best Education Book of 2011 from the National School Board Journal. And then he wrote in 2007, The Sandbox Investment, the Preschool Movement in Kids, as well as Kids First Politics. And that emerged also in many of our national magazines and newspapers, excerpts of it around the country. It was chosen in 2007 as San Francisco Chronicle's one of the best books of the year. It received the Association of American Publishers Award for Excellence. So he has done quite a bit in addition to this new book that he'll be here talking about this evening. He's been long committed to producing a generation of new public leaders, thought leaders. He is also the recipient of a Distinguished Teaching Award. So I imagine that tonight's talk is going to be indicative of what he does in the classroom. He's received twice the Gustavus Myers Human Rights Award for learning by heart, AIDS in America's communities, as well as Our Town, Race, Housing, and the Soul of Suburbia. He's done it all. He's a Renaissance man, really. And it's really my distinctive pleasure to welcome him to the stage. After he speaks for about half an hour, my colleague Sean Reardon and I will be in conversation with him with some pre-prepared questions, and then we will open it up to you, the audience. David Kirp.
So I figure with that introduction, there's no place to go but down. I was waiting to hear about the silver medal I won in the Olympics in '92 for cross-country skiing. Just kidding. So the first thing you should know about me is that I'm a bad academic, by which I mean there's not an agenda along the way, a research agenda along the way. And so about every topic that I've written, there's somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do. But my claim to fame is that I have gotten interested in everything from prenatal to postgraduate policy issues. And just a word about that AERA award, which was really exciting and really shocking. It's an organization of quant jocks, of which I am not one. And when I accepted the award, I said to them, my role model, I write, is The Simpsons. And they sort of looked at me the way you are looking at me. And I said, well, let me explain. 10-year-olds watch The Simpsons and they get something out of it. 20-year-olds watch The Simpsons, they get something different out of it. If you're 40, you can watch The Simpsons and see something yet again different. And so too with this book. You can pick it up and you can say it's a really cool read. And that's the hope. You can say this is it's a good read, and there's some framing here. There's some social science underneath this work, even if it's not sort of labeled as such. And then there are folks who are going to say, I'm going to look at that 40 pages of endnotes and see if that guy Kirp knows anything, or if he's just making it up. So you get to decide for yourselves. I hope you're all busily tweeting, blogging, whatevering at this very moment, and not about the green room that we're in. So let me go back to. I don't have to tell you how contentious a moment this is in American education. The dominant discourse is that the public schools are broken, that we're in a national crisis. Now, it's a report. I begin the book with a report co-authored a couple of years ago, co-authored by Joel Klein, then the Chancellor of New York City Schools, and someone who you may have heard of named Condi Rice. And it begins, educational failure puts the U.S.'s future economic prosperity, global position, and physical safety at risk. Physical safety, what the heck is that about? Sort of taken, so excited were they by the rhetoric that it sort of escaped reality. And the remedy, in that world, the remedy is high stakes, market-driven solutions, whether it's the public schools, or you close failing schools and fire lots of teachers and make the tests even higher and higher stakes tests, and you move to charter schools and then all the way to a pure market of vouchers. See, for example, what Bobby Jindal has installed for some kids in Louisiana. It's the wrong diagnosis. It's the wrong cure. And I think I'd say this about the public school. But Mark Twain said, reading his own obituary, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. We have 62 million kids in the country. So as a matter of whatever practical fact, whatever one thinks about charter schools, they're going to be an interesting epiphenomenon. They can't educate 62 million kids. They can't recruit 3.5 million teachers. So we've got to work with the public schools we have. And the story that I want to tell you is about one district that did amazingly at just that, Union City, New Jersey. And then I want to tell you that this isn't a one-off story, that you'll find districts across the country that under the radar are doing the same kinds of things as Union City. So what did Union City do? It did old school stuff, and I'll describe that in a minute, but here's why you want to pay attention. From 3rd grade through all the rest of the high stakes exams, the Union City students perform at about state level average. But what's more interesting to me, more than 90% of the students graduated from high school last year. 90%. 75% of those enrolled in college. Now, Union City, you'd never, if you went to Union City, it's a really exciting, vibrant place. It's kind of like the Mission District in San Francisco, without the white buses driving around. So you're 3 miles and a light year away from Times Square. It is one of the poorest communities, one of the 100 poorest communities in the country. It's the most crowded city in the country, and that crowdedness doesn't have, there are no skyscrapers in this place. It's small apartments where you have 3 bedrooms and 12 people living in them, 4 and 5 in a room behind a locked door with 1 shelf on the refrigerator. It's estimated that 1/3 of the people living in the town are not documented. It's an overwhelmingly Latino town. It's the third highest percent of free and reduced price lunches in New Jersey, and that number would be considerably higher, but for the fear of parents that if they stick their heads up, that they might well find themselves being deported. 75% of the kids come to school from homes where it's the telenovela, it's on the TV, it's football, not football, that is the language of the house is Spanish. And if you look across the if you look across the country at districts with heavy populations of poor immigrants, you're not going to find very happy stories by and large. I mean, characteristically, these are places in which the kids are just underserved, in which the dropout rates are enormous. So I spent a year in Union City as a kind of amateur anthropologist with essentially total access to the schools. I can wander in and out of any place that I might want to be. Meetings in the superintendent's office, in the teachers' lounges, dropping in on classrooms whenever I wanted to do that. I hung out, maybe a quarter of the time in one class, and I write about that. I may read a little bit about it where I was Mr. David to a bunch of third graders who were learning English. These are immigrant kids. They were learning English at the same time they were prepping for their first high stakes test. And then I spent a lot of time in other classrooms in that school, then in a sample of other schools in the district, and all the way up to the community, making sense of this place, you know, the multitudes and the Latino-ness and all the different communities that constitute being a Latino in America, and the political structure in which the system is embedded. It's pretty remarkable to have that kind of an open door. So what did they do? Very simple, straightforward, bottom line answer. No quick fixes, no miracle cures, no reaching for that bright, shiny object. There are no charter schools, there are no vouchers in Union City, there are no Teach for America teachers in Union City. It's very much doing the kinds of things that every educator with a pulse knows make sense. It's continuous improvement, improving at the margin, adapting at the margin. Now, there's nothing peculiar, especially even about the strategy. Those of you who know anything about preschool may have run into the high scope curriculum. It was the curriculum used in the Perry preschool, the iconic long-term success story of early education. There the kids come together, figure out what they're going to do, go do it. The teacher wanders around, helps, interjects. At the end of the day, the kids come together. Plan, do, review. Works for preschool kids, it works for school districts. And it works in business as well. Last year I was reading, the Times Sunday Business section had an interview with Reed Hastings. You'll recall the debacle at Netflix when he tried to split the company into the online stuff and the discs and was going to charge different amounts. It was as bad as New Coke. And he came back. And so the question was, what'd you do? And here's what he said. Plenty of people were urging me to take drastic steps to show the company was regaining momentum. There was amazing pressure to come up with a shiny object that would make everything better. But the phrase I used was, there are no shortcuts. We weren't going to find an idea or gesture that would make people love us again overnight. We had to earn their trust, being very steady and disciplined. I couldn't say for sure we'd recover, but I was confident that our best odds would be very steady and focus on improving the service. Just change a couple of words and you get, in the education context, what seems to have worked for a number of districts. Now, back to education. The guts of the education mission is really simple. What are you trying to do? You're trying to bring together talented teachers, challenging curriculum, engaged students. Everything else you can build out from that. Everything you do in a district ought to be supporting that triangle. Talented teachers, engaged students, challenging curriculum. And what did that mean in Union City? Again, what I'm going to say, I just hope that nobody falls asleep between now and the time we get to the end of this little shopping list, because it's such familiar stuff. Begins with 2 years of preschool. Full day preschool for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. New Jersey schools are lucky in that state high court mandated free universal preschool for the poorest school districts in the state. Some of them threw the money away. Union City has done an amazing job. It has taken 30 some odd private, not-profit, for-profit, municipal-run places, some of them scarily unsafe, where, for example, the proprietor of one school as an entrepreneur decided that the thing to do to make the place kind of romantic was to have little candles all around the floor and the shelves and whatever, right? So that was that. And now, if you go into those preschools, all those preschools, you find a standard, a quality level. It's not quite as good in all cases as to what their showplace public school preschool is. And that preschool, by the way, good enough to entice Arnie Duncan recently to make a visit there. Unfortunately, he didn't see the rest of the system and didn't connect the dots. But at least that says something about what the level that the system is aiming for in terms of early education. There are, when Union City was trying to figure out what it needed to do in order to go from the bottom, where it was, late 1980s, so bad, second worst in the state. I don't know how many of you know Camden, New Jersey. It doesn't get worse than that, and so the rallying cry in Union City was thank God for Camden. And what they figured out, a guy who was a mid-level life-term guy in the district, figured out that Union City needed to do two things. It needed to worry about bilingual education. It needed to worry about reading. Those are the big ticket items along the way. And so if you walk into any classroom there, you're going to find words all over the place. It's a word-soaked environment. And the kids are writing and drawing and doing science projects. They're keeping diaries from as early as they can do this. The teachers are making it a point to get the kids to engage in language in ways broader than bad, mad, sad, glad. And the reason for that is pretty clear. There's by now classic research, 20-year-old research, which talks about how by the time a child is 4, kids from poor families have heard 30 million fewer words than kids from professional families. Well, that's the old news. The new news, which comes out of this campus, is that those differences are detectable at 18 months and have already essentially doubled by 24 months. So it's a lot of work that the district needs to do to give kids a feel for language. Bilingual education. We get a moment of silence for the poor kids who have to go to school, poor non-English speaking kids who have to go to school in California, where ideology reigns over pedagogy. There is no argument that I know of among linguists that if a child doesn't become fluent in her native language, doesn't learn how to speak, how to write, how to read with fluency, there's always going to be this problem that retards their development in English. It's going to take them longer, and they're not going to do as well. And so what Union City does is it begins, for these kids, it begins in Spanish and gradually introduces English depending on the level of the kids' grasp of their own language and their grasp of curricular material. So if you walk into a typical classroom, at least in the elementary schools, you'll find kids grouped, often in 3, 4, 5 groups, depending both on language and on where they are academically. That means, by the way, that the classes may be small, and they are typically 20 or fewer, but the teacher in that classroom has 4 preps to do, depending upon language and level within one class. That's tough. At the high school level, biggest challenge for the school district are the teenagers who show up from Latin America, from Ecuador or DR or Guatemala. They have pieces of paper that say, I have an 8th grade education. In reality, those pieces of paper were purchased for $25 or $50 from the local principal. These are kids who have had so little education they couldn't find their own country on a map. So Union City has 4 years to teach them Spanish, to teach them English, to get them caught up in all that material, and to teach them American. And the graduation rate for that population is about 50%. Now, 50% may or may not sound like a lot, but let me just say that by way of comparison, the graduation rate, I was in New York recently, so I looked it up. Buffalo, Syracuse, Cleveland, and here, right in River City, Oakland, is lower system-wide than for this population of kids who just have 4 strikes against them to start out. And it's as amazing that last year of the top 20 students, 3 of them had come from Latin America, not knowing a word of English. And these are not kids from professional families who had lots of tutors around. These guys, some of these guys are going to wind up winning Gates Millennial Scholarships. The top students wind up in the Ivy League schools, but they're paying attention to everybody in that school system. as I thought about this recently, and I looked at what they were doing with special needs kids, with bilingual kids, and in reading and writing, I realized that in effect what Union City has done is to individualize instruction for everybody. There is an IEP, in effect, there is an IEP for almost all the kids in this district. In the elementary school I was in, the principal spent a month at the end of the year deciding which kids were going to go with which teachers. So which kids, in her judgment, and the judgment of the teachers, and the judgment of anybody in the school who knew them, needed, a kick in the pants, and who needed a hug. Which kids worked well together, which kids should be kept apart. And that kind of attention to detail is just crucial, because any teacher, and many of you have been teachers, will tell you that the informal constitution of the class, the makeup of the class, the power dynamic in the classroom among the students is a crucial part of the success or failure of a given year. The curriculum developed initially by a team of teachers and administrators who didn't just pick books here and there. They went out and did the learning about what seemed to be effective generally as a strategy for teaching reading or writing and math, and then picked and chose across the materials to see what was going to work for them. And it's always their way. The preschools had a choice of 6 curricula to use under the state's regime, or a district could pick its own and justify it on the basis of evidence. Union City was the one place in the district that picked its own curriculum. And the curricular decisions aren't made by outside folks. They're made by a team of good teachers working over the summer to put the material together, which makes it, among other things, a whole lot easier for other teachers to accept because it's their peers that are recommending it. Across this district, the curriculum is uniform. So there is no portfolio here. There is a single model. And why might Union City have done this? Certainly wasn't necessary for them to do this, and there are other strategies that will work well, but the argument in Union City is poor kids move a lot, 2 or 3 times a year. Simple demographic fact. You're at one school with a charismatic principal, and she's instituted curriculum A, and then you go to another school with another charismatic principal, and she has instituted curriculum B. Kids are lost. This way you can go, really, you can leave one school on a Friday, come back on a Monday, and you won't have missed anything. The school district has developed and uses its own assessment instruments to track students during the course of the year. Now, typically, what happens in the high-stakes test is the tests are administered in the spring, results come in the summer, which is really not very helpful if what you're trying to do is to improve the kind of education that the kids are getting. Union City tests early in January for the primary middle schools, several times at the high school. And they can slice and dice the data in ways that would make the accountability folks salivate. How is Ms. Jones doing as compared to the 4 other teachers in 4th grade? How is she doing compared to the way she did last year? How is she doing with students who've been in this country for less than 5 years and those who've been there for more than 5 years? How's she doing in math as opposed to language arts? How's she doing with word problems as opposed to number problems in math? It's an amazing array of data to have, but they use it not to punish or discipline, but as a means of figuring out where teachers need help and where students need help. Teachers in the school district come from schools, many of which I had never heard of, and I wrote a book about higher education. And I confess that one of the big pieces of learning I did was to get rid of my snobism, which said, we really want is an American school system filled with teachers from the top colleges in the country. What I would sit in on classes across the board, and again, I was choosing. There were okay classes, there were a lot of good classes, and there were some astonishing classes. And they're taught by, I think of one, best special ed class I've ever seen, taught by a guy who wanted to be an artist, dropped out of college after 2 years, went to work at the post office schlepping bags around, worked there for 10 years, bought a moving van, was a mover for 2 years, hated every minute of it, he says, went back to school. And if you walk into his 8th grade math and science class, for one thing, you wouldn't know you were in a special ed class. He's really a model of both excitement and expectations, and high expectations. Teachers work with each other. They have time set aside to collaborate. You see teachers moving from classroom to classroom, helping out in lessons. The 3rd grade teachers, when I was there, were called the Dream Team, not because their kids did so well on the tests, which they did, but because they were regarded as role models in terms of the amount of collaborating they did. And the way they do professional development is not by sending folks off to some fancy operation for a weekend where what goes on is known in the trade as spray and pray, but instead they bring the coaches into the classrooms, working with the teachers on the problems that those teachers are having. By the way, another couple of words about the teachers. These teachers are homebodies in Union City. Some of them are immigrants and came to this country from Latin America, but once they're in Union City, most of them born there, went to school there or nearby, college, came back, took a job, started a family, all within an hour's drive. And that's America. That is what American teachers look like. People want to be in Palo Alto or San Francisco or Boston, but nobody's racing, to be in Hattiesburg, or Pierre, South Dakota, right? Or that's not, Bakersfield. Those are places that are going to draw heavily on their own. And the fact that this district has done so well with those teachers is really, to me, an optimistic note. The other fact worth noting, this is kind of sobering one, when I would ask these teachers how they learned to teach, they talked about the work they did with their colleagues in the classroom, the conversations they had, the coaching they had. I didn't push the question because I didn't want to set it up, but there wasn't a single teacher who mentioned her or his education in college. I thought that was really interesting in terms of what schools of education are doing, at least with these teachers. The schools reach out to parents. They use parent liaisons who are really folks of the neighborhood, who know the people who were there, and not only do the liaisons get hold of the parents when something is going wrong with their kids, the parents come to them when, I don't have money for a winter coat, can you get me on the list for public housing? What do you have any thoughts about where I might get jobs? And the liaisons are going to know the place so well they don't have to look those numbers up. They're sitting in their heads. Union City has built a school system out of a system of schools. Most districts are. It's the herd of cats phenomenon. Each teacher goes her own way, and if that doesn't happen, each principal goes her own way. Very hard to construct out of that an enterprise that works together. And I'm happy to talk about how they've managed to do that. They really do have people thinking along the same lines. And the leadership sets a standard that permeates the system. It's a high expectation system. And you get it from the superintendent down to the teacher. It's the you can make it. We're going to push you. If you're willing to be pushed, you can make it. It's a culture of respect and a culture of caring, and what I call in the book a culture of abrazos. And one story I do want to tell about an 8th grade math teacher. Kind of a middle-aged woman teaching a not very exciting lesson, and her back is to the board, and the kids are just rapt. And I know it isn't because I'm sitting in that room. I've slipped into the room to see what's going on. And I asked her at the end of class, how do you explain this? And she said, let me tell you a story. A week ago, there was a boy who came here, transferred from another school district. And when I was writing something on the board, he starts making fun of me to the group that was sitting around him. And the other students say to him, cut it out. And then those students go up to the teacher after class and say, teacher, Ms. Jones, we have your back. Well, I mean, I don't know what you were like in 8th grade, but the concept of we have your back, or its equivalent, did not figure in the way we thought about the world. Finally, the system is always a work in progress. There are changes being made at every level along the way. The program they've developed, for example, for those kids who come in not speaking English in the high school, that's new. What they're doing for those kids is new because they saw all these kids dropping out. That wasn't going to work for them. They looked to see what was out there that they could use. What could they develop that would seem to make sense? What kind of partnerships could they strike? In the last couple of years, they won national awards for the things that they implemented a few years ago. So I'm done with Union City. I leave. I sit down. I start writing. I have this fantasy that I'm really writing a series of New Yorker articles and who thinks about public policy in these moments. And then I realize, I'm supposed to be a public policy guy. So what I want to do is to answer the question that I know I'm going to get. That is a great story, but. And there is no group that I know that's more inclined to the not made here phenomenon than educators. Always find an explanation as to why something that was done in Jonesville isn't going to work in Brownsville. So I went looking for districts that were bigger, smaller, that were African American, Latino, white, more multicultural immigrant kids, unionized, not unionized, high expenditure, low expenditure, elected board, appointed board. I looked for every factor that I could find. Now, this is not an analysis that any self-respecting statistician would credit, but I wasn't trying, that wasn't my intent. My intent was to figure out, what are these places? These are places that I was looking for that beat the demographic odds. If you look at who the student population is, those kids were doing better in math and reading than, substantially better, than their peer districts with that socioeconomic group. And I found, to my, I guess, surprise, that they were all essentially doing the same thing. A lot of variations on the theme, but building their systems of support from preschool through high school. Not doing anything fancy. Doing the kinds of things that educators, wherever you talk to an educator, they know this stuff works. There's one thing that all of them had in common. It's the one non-negotiable, and it's the hardest thing in the world, and that is stability. All of these districts had come to a point of crisis, realized that's where they were, and made a bet that turned out to be a bet for the long run. The average tenure of an American urban school superintendent is just nudged up a bit, so it's now 3 years. Well, I don't care if you won the MacArthur Genius Prize. You're not going to turn around an organization as complex as the school system in 3 years. And that's the challenge. And if you talk to anybody who's trying to implement substantial reforms in American education, they're going to be wringing their hands over the number of superintendents they've been through, or the principals or the teachers who've come and gone. But at the superintendent level, there's a very distressing dynamic that sets in, which is, the school board says, we need a miracle worker. And a bunch of applicants come in, and they pick the miracle worker they like best. And she shows up on the job, and the first year she's getting the lay of the land. And the second year she's trying to make something happen. And by the third year, when nothing spectacular has happened, she's gone. Probably some of the members of the school board are gone because they're being held accountable for the failure of that superintendent. In comes a new miracle worker. It doesn't work that way. So the question, the challenge, and it's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for, for the citizenry writ large, is we're a very impatient country, not just in education. But impatience is going to be a sure recipe for failure. So really, the puzzle is, are Americans willing to believe that Aesop was sometimes right, that sometimes the tortoise actually eats the hare? That's the Union City story. Thank you.
Before we throw it open to the group, the first question is a very basic question because I'm going to assume that a number of people in the room have not read the book yet, but after tonight they will have. And you've given us a very nice introduction to the book. So I want you to give us a little bit more detail, if you will, David, about, now here's my question. Did you go to find Union City or did it find you? And so how did you gain entree into this setting? in order to do the research and the writing that you've done. That's the first. This is a two-part question. And then the second part of that question is, if you tell us what you knew about the schools or the district prior to going, and then what became the most surprising or startling once you embedded yourself in the school district?
Those are great questions. I came upon Union City because I was writing a book called Kids First, which you mentioned before. And those 5 big ideas are no more or less flashy than what Union City did. And one of them is really good early childhood education. And I'd written a book about early childhood education. I didn't want to just take a chapter and drop it in there. So I was looking for other places to go. And I talked to my friends and they said, you should go to New Jersey. And I said, which amazingly I hadn't been to New Jersey before. And you should go to Union City because it's the best place. So I went to Union City and I spent a few days there and I came away duly impressed. I learned a lot more about what was going on there in the context of writing this book. And I knew that their test scores were good. I didn't know anything about graduation rates. I knew their test scores were good. And I wondered why. And I had some time, so I thought, I'm in a pre-K to 8 school. So I'm going to wander around accompanied by, but not directed by, the principal of the school. I'd look at something on the bulletin board and I'd say, that's cool, let's go in here. So nobody knew that I was going to do this. There was no warning that this guy was going to be there. And I went to those classes. And that comment I made about what the teachers were like overall definitely fit that day. There wasn't that mythical urban legend teacher who's reading the newspaper. By the way, I saw one of them and I thought, aha, gotcha. Mm-hmm. And it turned out I was actually there with the academic principal of the school. He was horrified. This was a class in forensic science, and the kids were busy worrying about the CSI, the body on the floor, et cetera. And there was this teacher like this with a cup of coffee, and the principal said something, and the teacher put his paper down. What are you doing? He said, I'm a substitute. No longer. Right? That was it. That was his first and last day in the system. So I was really I don't start out with theories or models. My students are going to be tired of hearing "earn your theory." I'm an overdetermined journalist, lawyer. That's all bottom-up stuff. So I wanted to know what made this school system work. And there was a moment. This isn't the question you asked, but I think it's pertinent. There was a moment about a month in that I was ready to give up. And I was ready to give up because I had encountered an enormous amount of pretty raw politics in this system. This is New Jersey, this is Hudson County, this is the area that Mayor Daley would have admired in terms of their efficiency and in making the system work. And a friend of mine said, are you enjoying yourself? And I said, I love being in the school, I love being in the classroom. He said, look, you've got a semester, you're here, you're in New York, just hang out in the school, you'll learn something. And then what happened to me is what happens to anthropologists the world over, as I now understand it. You start out by loving your subjects, then you're disillusioned by your subjects, then you come to see, what's going on in the round. I think what surprised me was the consistency of commitment across that system, including the kids. I think there was a day that I was there. There was a new principal. The second year, I come back the second year, and the guy who had been the academic vice principal was now the principal. And he had lots of dreams for the school. But on day one of the school year, a very popular senior is driving in a car with her boyfriend who is drunk. He wraps a car around the tree. She's dead. He walks away. So now that's everything stops. And he decided that what he would do would be he would turn to the students and say, I want you to organize what we should do as a memorial service. And they did brilliantly. So there's that kind of sense permeating the system. It's hardly a perfect place, obviously. There can be problems. There's my other discovery on the other side of this was that when I kept asking this question to folks when I saw the occasional bad teacher, and I said something about it, and they said, there are teachers who hate kids. Now, you may all know that. I didn't know that. I was really surprised at that. And the downside of a system that's about encouragements and incentives is that there are people teaching in that school system who shouldn't be there.
So you keep talking about the consistency across the district, which reminds me that one of the things that struck me when I read the book was that it's about a school district, that it sort of chooses the district as the unit of analysis, and it reminded me of two other books in certain ways. One is Tracy Kidder's book, School Teacher, and one was Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's book, The Good High School, which are both these sort of in-depth portraits. But the first is at the classroom level, the second is at the school level, and yours is in some sense the same kind of book, but at the district level. And so I wondered how deliberate it was, or whether you think the district is the right unit of action. Because a lot of people would say it's the teacher, or it's the federal policy, or it's state policy. So is the district the place where we can get the most leverage?
Well, I thought we have a bunch of really good books about outstanding teachers. You know, Sam Friedman's book about Seward High School is a great book about a school, and there are bunches of others out there. But there doesn't seem to, those aren't leverage points writ large, and as a policy guy, I wanted to think about where could you focus your energies in a way that might have a broader effect. So that's why the district. I think the district is, at least the districts that I've seen, are really critical units. Now, obviously, you know, the Washington and the state permeates that story. I think of Union City as being, you know, it's state supported. It's also state molested by all the standards and rules that it's got to deal with. But at the end of the day, those folks are in Trenton or Sacramento or wherever. The principal has a powerful influence on schools. But you've got a district that can figure out which principal is going to be at which schools and which teachers are going to be in which schools. So I thought it was a sort of a useful middle ground. You know, if you're thinking about reform strategies, you could be thinking in those terms.
So to follow up on that, David, you know, in the organizational literature, there's this idea of decoupling. And so what's fascinating as I'm listening to you is trying to figure out, if you start at this macro level, how you get this coupling all the way down to the classroom level. Like, what were the key mechanisms to keep the system so stitched together in that kind of seamless way?
Well, let me just describe one of them, because it's, you know, some of them you could imagine. There is a culture, and the people in that school, the principals were teachers, and then they were specialist teachers, and then they were assistant principals, and then they moved to an elementary school, and moved, you know, like so. So they knew the culture. You know, this is a little bit like how did the universe get created, right? So that, but they knew by now they're embedded in this culture. But what the school system did to try to keep the schools together was a strategy they call face-to-face meetings. Twice a year, the superintendent and the top staff there, the folks responsible for bilingual education and reading and other programs, special ed, would come together at each school, and the school would have its top folks there, and they would prepare a pretty fat binder describing what they'd done. And the agenda was always, where were we the last time we met? What's going on now? And, you know, what do you see coming down the road? And what can we do within reason to help? Now, I asked after being at lots of these, so what's the BS factor that I'm getting here? I thought there was certainly, you know, maybe a third of what you were getting was BS, but you can't, there are things like, you know, suspension rates and test scores and teacher departures and the like that you can't hide. And then those meetings would be followed up by surprise visits, unannounced visits by the assistant superintendent for academics. And she would come to a school, do exactly what I did. She'd walk into classrooms, she'd take notes, and she'd go to the principal and say, here are some things that I saw that you want to work on. The principal in the high school would go into classes, and because he was about figuring out ways to improve teaching, teachers actually liked him being there. Now, I was enough of a journalist to be suspicious, right? To think, there's got to be somebody out, there's got to be a malcontent in this high school. I mean, there are 2,800 kids in this high school. You've got lots of teachers. I couldn't find them. He is a pretty astonishing guy. But even in the schools where you would find the outliers, and there certainly were people in Washington school who really weren't with teachers, who weren't with the program. They would be the out group, because the value system in the school was about collaboration, about working together. Next to parents, the people who most want bad teachers out of the schools are the other teachers in those schools. And there would be no internal reward system, for being the difficult child, the dissenter, the troublemaker. That was part of the process too.
So where does that culture come from? It's hard to recommend to a policymaker that one should mandate a collaborative, supportive culture.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, if you look at, for example, I sat on a sort of stage in a conversation with Carmen Farina, who's the new chancellor in New York. You listen to how it is that she thinks about encouraging collaboration, getting schools to work together, building programs that are bigger than one class. She's the chancellor of the New York schools, and I was asked, by the way, so what's your advice to the new chancellor of the New York schools? And I said, I always thought New York and Los Angeles were too big to succeed. And I got this audience, I'm in New York, right, this audience. I said, if anybody has a shot at it, it would be Carmen Farina, and I think that's right. And she not only sort of has said that, there's a wonderful little unknown book that she wrote about leadership at the school and school district level, which nobody read because it was published by some obscure publisher and it's not a particularly engaging book. But it tells you there's both theories and models, and there's everything down to here's the memo that you should send out, here's why you want to do the planning in June and not the planning in September, and here's how you get people on board, and here's how you engage parents, and here's how you keep parents from totally thinking they run the show and that you're just an appendix and like so. So I disagree. I think you can do a lot in each one of these school districts. And so you have a place like Aldine, Texas, which I've never heard of. Many of you haven't heard of either. It's Houston's poor cousin. It has more students than Boston. It has more students than Washington, D.C. And its kickoff, what their come to Jesus moment was when the business community said, we can't hire your graduates because they can't read and they can't write. And that's what they played off, right? This is a district with $7,800 a kid. This is a district where if you walk into the superintendent's office, you want a cup of coffee, you put a quarter in the glass jar where you go into the district. They have to make horrible, horrible choices that no district should be forced to make that kind of money. But they've built a culture around that. And one of the things that happens in these places, I think the culture grows out of success. So when Aldine said, we're going to do one curriculum, the teachers were just furious. They've been doing their own thing forever. But when, in year 2, they win an Outstanding Improvement Award from the state of Texas, okay, maybe she's right. Maybe we should listen to her. Maybe we should do this. Like, that's the kind of thing that winds up happening.
So David, but how much of this hinges on the charismatic leader with a certain type of mindset? Here's the question, if that person were to leave, does the system endure? Or does it take the kind of leader with certain traits and mindsets to keep the system together?
You think about charismatic leaders, if this was a word association test, Michelle Rhee would be the name that came to mind first, because whatever one thinks about Michelle, she was charismatic. None of these people who I met with would pass the charisma tests. They're, as the superintendent of Union City said, we're worker bees. There was somebody who had enough of a set of ideas and enough of a connection to the community to make things work. But you don't have to look, if you're a superintendent, if you've grown up in a community like this, it isn't hard to figure out that you've got to do something about reading. Every one of these places, whether they had any money or not, knew you had to start with preschool. They all figured that teachers need help. These are not, genius concepts. The genius concepts, are produced by people at Stanford and Berkeley, but they're not what's going on, right, in those places. So when the superintendents of any of the places that I went to, when they leave, I am very confident that the system will carry on and it will get better. I know who the next superintendent of Union City is surely going to be the guy who's the principal in the high school. There's a sense of the kinds of things he might do at the margin to make this a better system. You know, Josh Starr brought into Montgomery County, you know, to succeed. I'm blanking on the name of the famous superintendent there. Yeah, Jerry Wiest said, you know, we've got to make the curriculum for primary schools more intellectually challenging, less kind of rote, less drill and skill. And so we're going to do that. That's change at the margin. So no, these are not the places where you worry about institutionalization. You worry about it when somebody comes in and, you know, it's, you know, coming into River City and saying, look, follow me, I'm the Pied Piper, you know. That's where you got trouble.
There is, I mean, I was sort of thinking the same thing. There's a sort of journalistic feature of the book, and in which you describe certain characters, and there's these sort of very memorable characters for those of you who have read the book. Alina, the teacher, the mayor, whose name I'm forgetting, the principal of the high school, who are described journalistically as these sort of people who are sort of central to the change because the plot kind of needs people to do that. But sort of what you're saying is that the plot doesn't really need those particular people. It would work without those particular people.
So you've used journalism twice, and I don't think journalists have 30 pages of endnotes. I think I wear the scholarship lightly, but it's there. And yes, I'm using illustrative folks, as of last count, considered ethnographers. And I take issue with that because in academic circles, it's a very two-edged sword. You know, academics don't think of The Simpsons as their model. And I think that's important. For those of you who are going to be academics, listen to him, don't listen to me. Right? Because this is definitely a don't try this at home folks career. Yeah, look, when you say to somebody, this book is interesting, and it's in education, they say, did David Tyack write it? You know? They don't say, let's look at the past winners of the AERA award and see and hand that book to the spouse of the author, you know, or the neighbor to read. So I think it's crucially important to write stuff that will read as a good read, the 10-year-old story, that will read as a good read with an intellectual framework that makes it not journalism, and that reads as a piece of scholarship.
Let me just be clear, I didn't mean journalism pejoratively, I meant engaging writing. That is, that there was a sort of there's a narrative to it, there are characters, and that it tells a story in service of the kind of larger scholarly sort of story, but it tells it with people, and so there's a way that one could read into it, oh, it's the people who sort of matter.
But if you think about, yes, and indeed the book needs character and it needs narrative. I had no idea what the narrative would be, obviously, when I started out. But if you just take a little moment in the school where Alina Basbali, who's this amazing teacher, is teaching, and you remember that at the end of the fall chapter, I talk about the decorations on the doors, the Christmas decorations, the holiday decorations on the doors. Nobody was pushing that as an idea. It happened because it was what the culture of the school was about. So when I talk about the high school, not only am I suspicious of what I'm hearing about this new principal, I do have data, figures. I have the evaluations by the teachers of the past principal and the present principal, which were prepared as part of the state review. So I've got something to confirm what it is that I'm doing. So one of the reasons why I feel comfortable with this mode of working in this stuff is that when I talk to people in the education business, they'll say, you got it. And I don't think they're saying that to pat me on the head, well, they might be. You have a sense of what life is like in this world. And again, I think, it's a very funny hat trick to try pulling, to try to write something that you can assign in a graduate seminar and something that you could assign in a freshman course in urban education.
And I'm sure Oxford University Press is not in any way disgruntled. I'm sure they're very happy and laughing all the way to the bank.
Well, I got to say something about that, about Oxford. The head of the press, because it was so remarkable. Actually, I had an editor who edited, but more importantly, when the book came out, the guy who's the president of the press loved the book so much that he sent it out to everybody in the company. If you know somebody in education who you think would be interested in this book, we'll give them to you, free. That's hundreds of books that go out the door. So that was, that I really did luck out on, because indeed, the bottom line matters, but they were excited about this thing before there was a bottom line.
Now let me ask you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience here. In terms of telling this story, one of the things that was really striking to me is that, there's your wit, but there is also latent criticism in this book of very popular educational reformers. People like Michelle Rhee, there seems to be, what I read.
Blatant. That was pretty blatant.
Yeah. I'm trying to use euphemisms here, yeah. But you seem to have this critique of the flashier, more popular, kind of silver bullet reforms. And I want you to tell us what makes you so skeptical of, you use Geoffrey Canada, Michelle, I'm just going to name call now, Michelle Rhee and others, and then you compare those in some ways to what's happening in Union City. What's behind that skepticism?
So actually I didn't use Geoffrey Canada. I think Geoffrey Canada did a great thing in calling attention to the links between school and community. So I want to be clear about the fact that he's not there. Joel Klein, indeed, right? And Michelle Rhee. I don't think, I have this theory in my head that I better do something about testing out, because I keep trying it out, which is underneath all of these debates, there's a fundamental psychological division between two kinds of people. The Puritans, remember McGuffey's Reader? Some of you who took education history may have read this. Letter A, in Adam's fall we sinned all. And that view of human nature says that if you don't push, prod, hold accountable, discipline people, their natural state is to be slackers. And then there are the better angels of our nature folks, the transcendentalists, who would say very differently that most people want to do the right thing, and if you support them and help them, they will. And if you trace out all of the divisions that exist now, I think you'd find something like that undergirding that story. And I just don't, look, if there was evidence that the market model, bluntly applied, worked, there was evidence that charter schools were so much better and that closing schools and opening new schools was a great improvement in education, I'd be writing a different story. I didn't come into this with an ideology, but I guess in the end what I came to realize is that I'm a better angel or a nature guy.
Okay.
So we have some time for questions from you guys. So, and let's make sure that some of the students in the class ask questions.
And I know there are certain students who have read this book already, so you have no out, by the way. So we'll take questions. You want to take your own questions? Okay, yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak to how the quality of preschool was raised in Union City. What work was done to lift the quality of the pre-K?
It's a great question, because when the state mandate came down, it was clear that there wasn't the space in the public schools to run all these schools, and it was clear as well that politically, the political system would never get away with shutting these schools. They made a difference in the community, and some of them, as I said, were really wretched. Well, for one thing, they all had, because of the court decision, they all had to hire somebody with a college degree and a specialism in child development. That helped. What really helped was these guys used master teachers amazingly adroitly. They would be at least a day a week in a school, and if a school was in trouble, and some of these schools are small, right? They're one classroom, two classrooms. They would just spend, a week straight in a place. And slowly, but slowly, the system got better. So if I had been there 4 years earlier, there would have been much more variation than there was when I was there, and I suspect that now things are better yet than they were. And another thing that happened to validate the importance of preschool, is that when the district took a look at its kindergartens, it didn't like what it saw. What it saw was was becoming, the new first grade, right? I mean, kids were in rows and they were doing, assignments, or they were spending all their day in circle time, just doing that, with the small recesses. And so they got the coaches, the preschool coaches, to redesign the kindergarten classes. Now, for those of you who know what that world is like, that's a revolution. And interestingly, some of the kindergarten teachers grieved to the union, and the union said, "Forget it. We think this is a great idea." So it's one of those moments in which the union actually was a positive force in that context. And now, when I talk to those teachers, the unhappy teachers, they were just scared about what happens when you break up a classroom, because you got a bunch of 4-year-olds, and they're in different groups around the room, and all chaos can reign. But they, with support, with coaching, they got into it as well. And I think what has happened there is that the quality of teaching seeps upward. Elementary school teachers think about kids, middle school teachers begin to think about subject matter, and high school teachers think of themselves as college teachers manqué, don't bother me, my job is to cover the curriculum. Hardest nut to crack, but they did work their way up the ladder.
Mark,
David, could you say something more about, I haven't read the book yet, but this is a low-income community, a very low-income community. And these low-income communities are rife with all kinds of issues. So the engaged students part of it. So can you say something about communities, no drugs, no gangs? What's out there?
Oh, there's surely drugs.
Gangs.
There are actually. It's funny. They have kind of like baby gangs in this town, not big gangs. The big gangs are in Jersey City and Newark. They're not there for whatever reason. They're not there.
Well, was there any relationship between the school district and that happening?
When the gang, this is where respect is really an interesting phenomenon. The school knew who the gang leaders were, and they had a treaty, in effect. You leave all of that, outside of the school and its surroundings. So there's no metal detector. There's none of that when you go into the schools. The worst you're going to get is 2 boys fighting over a girl or 2 girls fighting over a boy. And that certainly occurred. But you had, for example, the tardiness rate dropped in the high school to something like 2.5%.
So how do you?
And that's, again, I think a lot of this has to do with the ways in which this community is tightly bound to this institution, partly because of the role of liaisons. At the first parent assembly that I went to give you a story about that, pouring cats and dogs day, I thought nobody's going to show up. And of course, getting poor parents to come to schools is a hard thing to do. Almost every kid had somebody there. And the principal begins by saying, is there anybody in the audience who doesn't speak Spanish, which will give you a sense of where you are. And a few hands went up, so everything was done bilingually. She gets a big round of applause. When the liaison stands up, I mean, the house just, that's it. And this is like having another mom in the community. Lots of eyes, small community, lots of eyes that are there. Lots of supports available to kids. If a kid isn't in school, a phone call is going to go to the family to find out what's going on with that kid. So there's it's also the case, and this is a part of the story that I didn't touch on, and this gives me an opportunity to do so. It's a very politically unified community. The chapter about the mayor is called Part Mayor Daley, Part Mother Teresa. Irish, 3rd generation mayor whose Spanish is limited to buenos dias and gracias, who got 93% of the vote in the last election, who is also, because in New Jersey you can play dual roles, he is also one of the most powerful state senators. Helps a lot in terms of bringing home, in this case, a gorgeous high school to this place. And he is very committed to education, and he is somebody who has this amazing Rolodex in his head of things, people, places that he can draw on. But
Did he
one of
support
my
Christie for governor?
what?
Did he support-
He became when Christie became governor. He became Chris Christie's best Democratic friend, and at one point I take out after him a little bit in the book. He talks about him as the best governor that the state has had. Well, the best governor the state has had brought them a ton of money at a time when budget deficits were going, when he was laying off a third of the employees in the district. So it was a rough moment, right? When I was there, I'm right there in the middle of the recession. But he himself was a unifier, and only people in the U.S. talk about Latinos or Hispanics. It's not a term that anybody else in the world uses. They're Ecuadorians or Guatemalans or Dominican Republic or wherever. It's a country-focused, identity. And each of those countries, indeed, their immigrants have their own social life, their own clubs, and they come together. So that one of the Catholic churches had, there were two masses, one for the Colombians and one for the Mexicans. And it's not as though you had to go to the one, but that was sort of the way those masses had shaken out. When you saw the big parade, which was the Cuban parade, this is a town that had so many Latinos, so many Cubanos in it, more than any place except Miami. It was known as Havana on the Hudson. Most of those folks have moved out. Many of the businesses are still owned by them. They do the big Cuban Day parade. Everybody comes and everybody is involved in what it is that's going on. So there's a sense that there are lots of small groups in which connect immigrants to the place. And there is this overriding sense, which you do not have warfare among these people. And in part, the mayor, by knowing what symbolic gestures he can make to different communities, helps to bring them together. That makes Union City very special. And if you looked at a 95% African American community nearby, which brought on board many of the Union City staff to build a Union City there, without that kind of community support, without that kind of parent engagement, attendance was up and test scores were up. And then, to go back to my last comment, the old school board comes back, the crony school board comes back, they get rid of these folks, they bring in the old guard, scores go back down again. So these are important. Yeah, which I read about in the book. It's a sad proof of concept, right? So there are things that Union City has that give it a special advantage. But that's why I want to look at places that didn't have those advantages and have done well. Again, it is, I'd argue, the best urban school district in the country. But a lot of places are beating the competition with far fewer resources or human resources to draw on.
Try to get in a few more questions. There, you in the white shirt there, yes?
I think one of the things you said that really struck me is the commitment to long-term change. A lot of times why things don't work in urban districts, you have this sort of miracle idea comes in, this boom and bust cycle, right? And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about what has gotten the community in Union City to be patient. I think the point you just touched on, that you have a mayor who wins 93% of the vote. He's not thinking about re-election in that short-term way, but what are
he does.
What are other things?
No, it's really a good question. How do you get there, right? This is a version of the, how did this system start up? How do you get to that place of patience? And again, looking across a number of school districts, and I used as one of my samples the Broad Foundation Prize winners, and I love that as a database because Broad's claim to fame is not urban school districts, but he gives a $500,000 a year award to urban school districts, successful urban school districts. That was one of my samples, and each time round, there was some crisis. So Montgomery County, which is 14th biggest district in the country, a lot of rich, highly educated folks, more poor immigrant folks in that community, had run through a bunch of superintendents. Jerry Wiest arrives, and he says, here's what I can do over the next couple of years. And he walks into this fractious world where there is a school board and a county board. The school board sets education policy, the county board sets budgets. So he's got two sets of masters to deal with. And what happens in that case, and in other cases where I think folks have been patient, is that he meets his target. May even do better than his target, so the school board says, okay, we're going to re-up and we'll give you a little more leeway, and the money folks say we'll give you more money. And you develop a virtuous circle in which everybody is better off, including the folks who are on the school board, who after all in elected school districts are politicians for whom this is often their entryway into politics. So they don't, they want to make sure that what they're doing is going to serve them well their next stint. If they can say, look, we've been part of building a successful school system. We've done this. But having said that, that is the challenge in this country. Anybody who's been involved in major education reform efforts will tell you, as I said, the challenge is to weather all those changes. How can any idea, any system, however sturdy, survive amid all of those changes? And again, the one heartening thing about this story is it wasn't there always. It took some revelation, some realization that this was a crisis, something needed to be done, and we're going to really stick to it.
Yes, Linda.
Both Montgomery County and New Jersey have a lot of money
Yep.
per pupil, and both were pretty inequitable in how they spent it at one time.
Yep.
And changed that as part of the reforms
Yep.
that you described. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more for folks who don't know about the New Jersey Abbott district
Yep.
funding reforms and so on, and how the state policies played into Union City's success.
Actually, it will be your book that I'm borrowing from, so I might actually ask you to do this, but nonetheless. So Montgomery County is an interesting story because not everybody has a deep pocket Supreme Court that's going to give poor districts tons of money. But I'll get to New Jersey momentarily. Montgomery County had its funding. It was distributing dollars on a one-to-one basis. Every school had in theory the same number of dollars to spend, and we said to the board, this isn't working. The kids in what they call the red zone need more resources. They need smaller classes. They need more stuff. It's going to cost more money. We're going to take money from the green zone, from all those rich schools. We're going to move it here. But, he said, before you have a heart attack, I'm going to tell you that in your schools, you're going to see improvement. And the measure of improvement that Jerry Wiest used was the low-hanging fruit, which was advanced placement classes. There had not been many AP classes in the high flyer schools. So he could give those schools AP classes, and he could give the poor schools the money that they needed. And that worked. There were no losers in that particular story. And then, as I say, when he leaves, the new superintendent says, why is it that we're doing a challenging, educationally challenging curriculum for the rich kids, and we're doing a kind of drill and skill curriculum for the poor kids? And if you think about it for a moment, if you can't imagine learning that way, or you can't imagine your kids learning that way, why should poor kids learn that way and love to learn that way? New Jersey was, poor districts in New Jersey were blessed by a court decision called Abbott, which mandated both substantial infusions of money to the 30 poorest urban districts in the state, and required high quality preschool, 2-year full day preschool. And the impact, the overall impact on the performance of those kids in those districts, is a solid, I think you'd find methodologists who might argue about this one, but a solid demonstration that the array of things that these districts did on the whole produced a non-incremental improvement in terms of how they did, and those kids do better than their counterparts elsewhere. The, to me, more interesting story is that some districts which had more money than Union City, like Camden and Newark and Trenton, squandered the money. And you don't see the same kind of results in those places. Trenton is actually a richer community than Union City, but not much happened. And the reason was they, as in Trenton, said, okay, we're going to bring in a bunch of star principals, and they're going to each do their own thing. Well, there are many, many reasons why that is problematic, but empirically it just didn't work there.
Yeah.
There must be another one of your students who.
I'm thinking there has to be.
Is there some incentive that you need?
Yes.
So you briefly mentioned this in the beginning of your talk about how roughly 70% of the high school graduates go on to college. I was wondering if you had a little bit, and I know that most of the time you spent were in the schools, but if you had a better sense of, postgraduate, what some of these students look like.
It's great. No, it's a great question. And I'm very careful to say enrolled in college. Because Union City, like many districts until very recently, didn't even begin to collect data on what happened to those students afterwards. And that's true of a program like Kirp. Great high school graduation rates. Oh my goodness, our students are dropping out of college. But many districts haven't collected that data because they didn't want to know, basically. Montgomery County looked at the data dropouts and said, we haven't done anything for the C students who are going to go off to community college. We need to do something for them. Union City is now collecting that information, but I think maybe more importantly, it keeps raising the bar for high school kids. So now they say, well, it's great that all these kids wind up passing the state leaving exam, but the dirty little secret is if you pass the state graduation exam, you now have a 9th grade education, and you're almost guaranteed, if you barely pass, to wind up in remedial math and remedial English, and many of you are going to drop out because of the way those programs are constructed, a story for another day. So what we're going to do is we're going to require that all kids in the school as juniors take the preliminary SAT exam. So they don't expect all the kids to go to college. They don't expect all the kids to do brilliantly on that exam. But that says something to the students, and it says something to the teachers about what you need to do, about why here's a district which at the high school level is moving from good enough to good. And that's what it takes. So I'm guessing that Union City's, recent years, Union City's graduation rate is no better and no worse than lots of urban school districts of those folks who go on to college. And that's pathetic, right? It's in terms of what the dropout rate is in community colleges particularly. I will say, by the way, that at the top, they do brilliantly. They've got, and that is a charismatic 85-year-old Egyptian woman who was a refugee when King Farouk, literally, was overthrown in the 1950s, who just gives everything to those kids. But as standards improve and as they think about what a posse of students would look like, and as they focus on what happens beyond high school, that's one of those next steps. That's one of those improvement at the margin steps. It's really important.
Oh, Catherine.
So you talk about district reform and all that, but this is part of a larger education system that at least I personally see is inherently broken, and it needs more than just reform, it needs transformation. So do you see that just this district reform isn't enough, or in the process the entire education system needs to be transformed because of things like the glass ceiling, capitalism, things like that are also working against students and against the education system?
I don't know where to begin answering that question. If you are a classic sociology of education scholar, those are the right questions to be thinking about. If you're a policy guy, you think about improvement at the margin, and once you hear the word transformation, the antennae go up. Because people have been saying those words, in different vocabulary forever. The schools are failing and they've got to be whatever. And then when you raise the ante by getting to capitalism, right? Then you leave the sociology of education and you go over to the sociology department, whose job it is to identify what the underlying deficits of American society, and broader than that, one level up, people's inhumanity to one another. I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, certainly not the inequality part of that, and it's absolutely right. But, so do I think that this is going to work a revolution? Well, for one thing, American education really is a herd of cats. Nothing is going to work a revolution, right? And, you know, for another thing, I think this is an as compared to what story for me. So I think it's really important that people ask the big questions, ask the questions about, you know, rising inequality, certainly the questions about the system as a whole and what you can do with it. But they're not me. That's the best I can do by way of an answer. It's really it's a temperament thing. It's not anything else. We need both.
Yes, last question, yes.
Along those lines, when you talk about building like a culture of arousals, caring, and trust, like what advice would you give to like school board members and how to build that culture? Like I'm a high school teacher, and right now I don't feel there's a lot of trust. In fact, like I feel the opposite of stability. It feels like a really unstable time with new standards. It's very unstable. So as I'm looking I'm very distrustful right now. So how can, what should school board leaders be doing, or policy leaders doing to win my trust back in this unstable time we have?
So, and it is very much an unstable time which has been foisted on schools. I mean, the idea that teachers are expected to teach to a new set of norms, right, the Common Core, while in many places they're being tested under the old set of tests, is kind of craziness. So, and at the macro level, I really, you know, despair is the wrong word, but depressed is the right word. Josh Starr, the superintendent in Montgomery County, said, look, the Common Core works a large change in the expectations of teaching, the expectations of learning. It requires different kinds of tests. So let's take 2 or 3 years out to beta test the tests and to work with teachers and principals and kids and parents so that they're thinking differently. And Arnie Duncan's response was to call Josh Starr an armchair critic, which is really bizarre considering he's the superintendent of, you know, the big school districts. Odd ad hominem comment. So at that level, I really feel for folks who are in that system because we, right? The system has created this instability. But I think the place to start, what grade do you teach?
10.
Okay, what subject?
World history.
Okay, so the place to start for me is, in that case, with a lot of work going on across 10th grade and across history, where you really are figuring out together what you're doing. You are the island of stability and trust, and you build out to find allies in other places. You know, I was asked at one point, I was in a school in East Oakland, and I was talking about the importance of mentoring. And I was asked the most depressing question, which is, so if there's nobody in the school who really would be a good mentor, what do you do? I mean, that's one of those nightmare moments. And then, you know, I heard that twice in the past week, 5th graders had been held up at gunpoint, you know, to grab the silver chains around their neck. And I said, I'm out of here until you can figure out how to deal with the safety problem. I don't want to talk about pedagogy in this place. But those are the extremes. There are going to be folks, hopefully, who are in the system, your colleagues, who you can work with. Depending on the size of the community, you know, teachers work their tails off. I know this. If they have the energy to get involved in the politics of the community, you know, you can help improve the caliber of the folks who are actually, caliber in the sense of understanding and patience of the folks who are actually running the schools. The most important thing you can do is to create an island of trust with you and those kids, to be the Alina Basbali in that classroom that you've got. That's the starting place. You work your way out from
And if you want to read more about Alina Buswell, you have to buy the book, which will be available after this session. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you